What's up, guys? Election predictions 2020 here. And I don't know if you heard the breaking news today. And no, it's not about the coronavirus, but it's Bernie Sanders dropping out. And I know a lot of people thought this was a long time coming because since Super Tuesday, in fact, since South Carolina, Bernie Sanders really hasn't had um, a huge probability, or I mean, he's had the narrowest path to get the Democratic nomination. Um, and so he dropped out after the election in Wisconsin, primary elections in Wisconsin. And although those results probably won't be released until next Monday, is what the DNC said. Biden and Sanders did get a lot of data from there, and it's looking really good for Biden, and it was not looking good for Sanders there. And I think Sanders was hoping that with the coronavirus outbreak, um, this could be a tipping point or an inflection point in the Democratic primary election. He was hoping that maybe more people would be supportive of his more radical measures like Medicare for all and just more um, socialist, semi socialist policies like a bigger safety net, um, attacking big businesses, breaking apart monopolies, but he didn't really see that in the states that had their elections. And it wasn't a ton of states, but I think just saying from Wisconsin and a few other the states that had their elections, a lot of states like Ohio and New York, they canceled theirs. But I think Sanders found that his path was very narrow. But in this video, what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a hypothetical matchup of President Trump versus Sanders, because from here on forward, I'm just going to be focusing on Biden versus Trump because the general election is set. And I don't think people would have thought of it in this fashion. I know there's not a lot of media coverage about this right now because of the coronavirus, but if there was no coronavirus, I'm sure this would be the top story of the day and everyone would be talking about it. All right, but let's just hop right in. The first state I want to go to is the state of Florida. Florida is typically a state that is a swing state, and that would be highly contested in 2020. If the Democrat was Bernie Sanders, however, I think Donald Trump wins the state by a large margin. I mean, I would even almost put it in the safe column, but I'm just going to put it in the likely column right now. And the reason why I think Florida would go very strongly for President Trump is a lot of its population is older. I think the average age for the average Floridian is like in the 60s or something. And typically, older people they've lived through the Soviet Union, and I think they have a better grasp of what socialism and communism is. Rather than the younger people, they've lived in a capitalist society their whole life. They haven't really experienced anything different. So I think the older people would definitely, the swing voters would definitely go for President Trump over Sanders, or the more moderate Democrats just wouldn't turn out. They would stay home and vote just because they couldn't stomach a President Sanders. And also, Florida has a large Hispanic community and a large Cuban American population. These Cuban Americans tend to be more conservative than Hispanics at large in the country. And because Cuba was a dictatorship, a communist dictatorship, they tend to actually vote more for the Republicans, even though that has shifted. It did shift more in 2016. You saw more of the Cuban Americans voted for Hillary Clinton, but I think you would see them shift back in percentage terms to support President Trump, just because they've seen the damages of communism and socialism. And that isn't to say that a President Sanders would implement the same policies or that they would have the same effect. But I think that people are just some people who have seen the damage that socialism and communism can do in some of these countries. There'd be ads just blanketing the airwaves on just scenes of Venezuela and Cuba and the Soviet Union. And I do think that would stick with some Cuban Americans who have lived through that, some of them. And similar to Florida, I think Texas would also be in the likely column for President Trump. I think if Biden were the nominee, Texas would be a lot closer. But I think Texas has been solidly one of those states where people associate it with conservative policies and Republicans, even though it is trending blue. And I think that maybe some modern suburban voters, like outside of Dallas and San Antonio and Austin, who voted for Democrats in the 2018 midterms for Beto O'Rourke in the Senate race, I think that they would go back to President Trump just to show the Democratic Party and the country that they are not ready for a Sanders administration. They don't want radical measures like Medicare for all. And I think same with what I was saying with Florida. I think Hispanics tend to be more conservative than the average Democrat at large. So you might see some Hispanics in Texas go for President Trump, maybe even some who didn't vote for him in 2016. So next up, I want to go to the state of New Hampshire. New Hampshire is one of the states that would be likely Democratic. And New Hampshire is a little bit weird. I think that it would be in the likely Democratic column just because of its proximity to Vermont. And Senator Sanders, he is an independent senator in Vermont, but his approval ratings in Vermont are very, very high. The people of Vermont really like him, and I think that would bleed over a little bit to New Hampshire as well. And then also similar to New Hampshire, I think Maine would go the same way. I think he would have an appeal to the white working class in New Hampshire and Maine. I think the first district would be solidly Democratic, and the second district would just tilt towards the Democrats. President Trump won the second district of Maine in 2016. Next up, I want to go to the state of Nevada. This is a state that I think will lean towards the Democrats. This is a state that Bernie Sanders won in 2020 in the Democratic primary. He beat Joe Biden and all the other contenders when it was still a pretty crowded race. He did very well with the Latinos in Nevada, Nevada was kind of a turning point, or what Bernie Sanders thought was going to be a turning point in the election, because he thought that, look, I have this diverse appeal. I have a diverse group of supporters, Latinos, whites, African Americans. It didn't really turn itself out in the remainder of the Democratic primary, but I do think Nevada is one of these states that's trending blue. And I think despite being more radical, I think some swing voters would maybe go towards President Trump, but I think that there is excitement in Nevada and that overall it would go to Bernie Sanders. Next up is the state of Virginia. Virginia is one of these states that has been leaning Democratic for a while, even though George Bush won it. I think that Biden would win it by definitely a more comfortable margin. I think Trump would outperform outperform himself in 2016 and 2020 if Bernie Sanders was the Democratic, because Virginia is one of these states that has a large, highly educated population. It's right near DC, and I think a lot of the DC establishment fears Bernie Sanders. So you might see some people in Northern Virginia in this Nova area, um, just not turn out to vote or even vote for President Trump. And Virginia also has a large African American population, and Biden does a lot better with African Americans, and African Americans tend to be more conservative than the average Democrat. So you might just see some African Americans stay at home if Bernie Sanders was the nominee, and this would definitely give President Trump a boost in the state of Virginia. And next up is the state of North Carolina. I think this is a state that leans Republican. I North Carolina is a southern state, and even the Democrats in North Carolina tend to be more conservative than the Democrats like in New York and some of these more northeastern states. Their Democratic candidate for Senate, Cal Cunningham, is more conservative than the average Democrat. He's pretty moderate. So I would definitely see North Carolina as a state that Donald Trump would win pretty handily. In fact, I would even maybe put it in the likely column. He would probably win the state by like 4 to 5 points. Next up is the state of Colorado. I think this is a state that leans towards the Democrats, but it is not necessarily a state that would definitely go to Bernie Sanders in 2020. Colorado is one of the states that has a large, highly educated population, and I think that a lot of people in the suburbs who are fearful of a Sanders presidency could actually vote for President Trump. President Trump, I would say, is not as risky of a candidate right now because I think President Trump is a known quantity. His policies, even though his behavior can be a little erratic on a daily basis. I would say a Sanders administration is very much a wild card. You don't really know what it's going to look like. Are all of his policies going to be implemented or not? It's really kind of up in the air. So I think Colorado is one of those states that will lean towards the Democrats as it normally does in presidential elections. But I think that Joe Biden would do a lot better in the state of Colorado. Next up is Arizona. I think Arizona would lean towards the Republicans. This is a state that in my previous prediction with Joe Biden as the nominee, I had it tilting towards Joe Biden. I really just think that some of the Arizona swing voters who really don't like President Trump but are still pretty moderate, I think they would hold their nose and vote for President Trump just because Arizona tends to be one of those states where you have a lot of moderate swing voters. And I think they would just be Bernie Sanders' radical policies would turn them off. So next up, going to the Rust Belt, which will determine the 2020 election. And I included Ohio and Iowa, who some people consider as part of the Rust Belt too, as likely Republicans. I didn't really explain this. Donald Trump won these states by over 10 points in 2016, and I don't really see there being much movement. I don't see, although Bernie Sanders says he's going to bring in all these new voters and it's going to be the next revolution, I don't really see that. Bernie Sanders maybe could outperform Hillary Clinton in some of these states, and that was definitely his argument in 2016, but not enough to flip them. So I'm not really even going to put these in consideration. But first, it was the state of Wisconsin. I think Wisconsin would lean towards Donald Trump. I think Joe Biden would outperform Bernie Sanders in this state. And Wisconsin is one of these states that has actually been trending red for a while. In the Monomyth poll that came out earlier, it had Donald Trump beating all of the Democrats in Wisconsin. And Joe Biden did slightly better than Bernie Sanders in the state. I think Donald Trump was up by like 5 or 6 points to Bernie Sanders in Wisconsin. So I see this as a state that leans towards the Republicans. And Next up is the state of Minnesota. I'm going to put Minnesota as a state that tilts towards the Democrats. Minnesota is a very unique state, and I think if Bernie Sanders were the nominee, it could go either way. Um, but I still think that Minnesota, it's been a Democratic stronghold for a while, and I don't see Donald Trump being able to flip the state. I think you'll have some voters in Minnesota in 2020 that um, Bernie Sanders would be able to convince to vote for him. Bernie Sanders has kind of talked about this revolution. We need new ideas and being able to motivate non-voters and people who don't normally turn out. And I think he could do that in the state of Minnesota. Next up is the state of Michigan. And I think Michigan would be the closest state in a matchup between Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders. I think that Michigan would tilt towards the Democrats. Michigan is a state that Bernie Sanders narrowly beat Hillary Clinton in 2016. And although he lost to Joe Biden in 2020, I think that Bernie Sanders would beat Donald Trump in the state in 2020 as it is right now. I think there's a lot of appeal to the white working class voters that Donald Trump won in 2016 in the state of Michigan. And I think that Bernie Sanders could potentially swing these voters over to him in 2020. And as you can see, the last state here is Pennsylvania, the deciding state in the election. I have Pennsylvania as tilting towards the Republicans. I think that Joe Biden has an advantage in the state of Pennsylvania if he were the nominee, just because he's from Pennsylvania. He knows the Pennsylvania voters. He's from Scranton. But I think Pennsylvania is one of these states. It's fairly close to D.C., and it has cities in it like Philadelphia. And it's Pennsylvania. It's not the most highly educated state, but it has a lot of suburbs in it. And I think that a lot of the suburbanites that have been trending towards the Democratic Party in the past 4 years, they're kind of repulsed by Donald Trump and his behavior. But they're very moderate. There's people who voted Republican their entire lives. I do not think that they would be able to stomach voting for Bernie Sanders. So I think that Pennsylvania would tilt towards the Republicans. And overall, I definitely think that Biden is the safer option for the Democrats in 2020. I don't think he's the super inspiring figure like Obama. But I think that the Democrats in the 2020 primary just decided on we need someone who can beat Donald Trump. And I do think that they're right that Biden overall probably has a better chance. He has a more appeal to the moderate voters. I think he can swing some of the people in the suburbs, especially females who might be not so happy with Donald Trump's character and how he treats women. And I do think Biden will do better with African Americans than Hillary Clinton did in 2016. I don't think that Bernie Sanders would do as well with African Americans in 2020 as a whole. And I don't mean to generalize, but African Americans tend to be more conservative than the average Democrat. Same with the Hispanics too. So I see Bernie Sanders being able to maybe do better with working class white voters, but I see with the swing voters and more of the voters of color that Donald Trump could actually do better with them, and it would swing the election to him. So going forward, I'm just going to be talking about Biden and Trump and the Senate and maybe the House some. But please give a like and subscribe and comment on what you think on this potential matchup between Bernie Sanders and President Trump. Thank you.